One of the things, as folks will know, is that we have a tremendous partnership with Nanos research at Positive Energy. And over the last 3 years, we've conducted a variety of different public opinion surveys. We're releasing a survey today, our most extensive survey research that we've undertaken to date with Nanos research. And to share with us some of those findings, the highlights of those findings, I'm very delighted to be able to give the mic over to Positive Energy Research Team member, Dr. Stephen Bird, who is Associate Professor at Clarkson University. Please join me in welcoming Stephen to the stage.
I'm a little taller. Good morning. I'm going to beg your indulgence for 60 seconds. I'm the resident American on the team. I'm Canadian. I grew up in Montreal, but I've been in the States for over 30 years now. And I teach energy policy down at Clarkson, which is about 2 hours south of here. And yesterday we saw two events that I think are worth thinking about as we engage in this enterprise and the kind of engagement that Positive Energy has been involved in since I started with the team almost 4 or 5 years ago. So the interaction that occurred between the protesters and Minister Carr yesterday exemplified something that we see in Canada that does not necessarily occur in other places. It was a sense of restraint, a sense of listening, a sense of tolerance, and a sense of what I would think of as decency. It was uncomfortable, and some people might think on one side or the other that another side isn't being respectful. That's possible. I don't know. But what we saw yesterday is something that I see as being uniquely Canadian. And we saw it similarly on the streets of Toronto when the sole police officer was facing a man with a gun, or possibly a gun, over an extended period of time and managed not to shoot that person, right? Neither one of these events that occurred yesterday likely would have had the same outcome in the United States. So I encourage you to value that. It exemplifies everything that I treasure about being Canadian and about Canada. So with that, I will switch gears and now take on the role of being Nick Nanos. But I'm not Nick Nanos. I'm not nearly as pithy as Nick is, but I will do my best. So we have some tremendous survey data. There are 132 slides that have been released on the Positive Energy website. I am not going to show you all of them, but I will do my best to show you some of the more interesting results, I think. So with that, quickly, and I am not sure if it's possible to see my slides in this. Right now I'm just seeing me. Very nice. See yourself. Yeah, there we go. So 1,000 Canadians, and this includes data from 2015 and 2017, and it's a very good margin of error from a statistical perspective, excuse me. So quite robust statistically, and you're going to see some changes in data between 2015 and 2017. I'll be talking about energy projects first, and then going in and assessing Canada's performance thus far, and you will hear Nick's remarks replicated. Talking about trade-offs very explicitly, which I think is some of the most important work we've done with this survey research, and then talking about Canadians' view of the future. So, yeah, we're still just picture of me. So, views on decision making. And I'm sorry I have to turn around. I will do it this way. There we go. So we asked Canadians a lot, because there's been a lot of decisions about who needs to make decisions about energy projects. And you're going to see a clear picture emerge. It's all about national and or provincial governments, depending on the context. So Canadians across the board, by more than a 60% margin, believe that the national government should be making decisions about energy projects overall, and quite specifically, an edge to an independent regulatory agency as opposed to cabinet decisions. And I think that's important. And just by the way, another report which I wrote came out yesterday on the interaction between policymakers and regulators, and there's a lot to discuss in that, and certainly that relationship is critically important when we think about the notion of an independent regulator making decisions about energy projects. When we see in provincial projects, it's the same thing, right? The provincial government should be making it with an edge to an independent regulator making those decisions. And then we specifically ask people about two very large and important and controversial questions, pipelines and climate change. And in both cases, again, Canadians are quite clear. They want the national government to be making decisions about these critical issues for the future. Quebec, in this particular case, is an outlier, a very strong outlier, and this goes to Quebec's cultural history, certainly. And in this, we don't really know whether Canadians want an independent regulatory agency making decisions about pipelines or climate change, or the government itself. We'll look into that in future work. And then separately, when we take a look specifically whether the national interest is more important or the views of a specific province, right? So when you ask people direct comparative questions, again, they say very, very strongly and increasing over time that is the federal government that should have a say over the provinces, right? So not necessarily exemplifying all of the federalism in Canada's system. Similarly, when we ask about the views of local residents versus the national interest in any kind of an energy project, Canadians say, at least in theory, that it is the national interest that should trump the views of local interests, all other things being equal. And lastly, when we take a look at the question of Indigenous peoples, a critical issue right now facing Canada, it is the same thing. Canadians strongly feel that the national interest should have somewhat of a priority over those concerns. Let me move now to the question of public confidence, something that we've been engaged in and really was one of the reasons that the Positive Energy Project started, right, was this concern for public trust and public confidence. And as Nick said, politely, he said, we can do better. And indeed, the news is poor. So these are net, and I apologize, it's a little bit small, but hopefully you can see the numbers. These are net numbers. So we take the positive, the very good, and then minus the poor or very poor. And if it's a negative number, that means that overall Canadians feel that our performance is quite poor. And you will see negative numbers on the right-hand side all the way down. And we did this survey as well back in 2017, almost a year and a half ago. And in certain cases, things are getting worse. So public confidence in energy decision-making at minus 50, right? And when you're taking a look at net survey numbers, that is an incredibly poor ranking. So we do need to do better. And this is obviously demonstrated by the amount of controversy over several different energy projects occurring in Canada right now. Balancing the concerns of local communities, again, from minus 22 to minus 30, we're getting worse in terms of Canadians' perceptions. Developing a long-term vision for the future, again, Canadians believe we are not seeing enough progress being made, and that has gotten worse in a year and a half. Ensuring benefits are distributed equally, a negative outlook, but a relatively unchanging one. Providing clear, predictable regulatory rules, a really significant difference right now, minus 18 to minus 34. And the only thing that we show an improvement in is in terms of environmental policies aligning with Canadians' viewpoint on the environment. And here we see some improvement, but still a net negative. And this may be reflected because of some polarization on this issue. So, in terms of thinking about the values of local communities versus the national interest. It's not clear whether people think the bias is towards local communities or towards the national interest. So we need to unpack that in further work going forward. And that's certainly an interesting question to think about. Trade-offs. I think this is some of the most interesting work we've done. Asking Canadians specifically, you know, given X or Y, which would you prefer, right? And the trade-off data, I think, is really important. Here, this is one of the most important findings, and we've seen it consistently. It's growing smaller. Canadians, when they're asked explicitly, do I prioritize the environment or do I prioritize economic growth, they lean towards the environment. They're willing to make some degree of economic sacrifice to ensure protection of the environment, right? How much? That's a bigger question. Here we've asked some very explicit questions about the nature of economic partnerships with local and Indigenous communities, which sometimes have costs associated with them, and a variety of different questions. Again, these are net negative or net positive results. So Canadians are quite willing to have a decrease in tax revenue in order to support economic partnerships with Indigenous communities and with local communities. Relatively high numbers and a little bit higher for local communities than for Indigenous. They're willing to make some sacrifice, perhaps, and here we're moving into on the amount of energy projects that go forward. And these are energy projects of all kinds. We didn't specify renewable or traditional fossil fuel, et cetera. They are not willing to see an increase in energy prices, but this is not a strong, it's a small negative overall. But they are very concerned that we don't see economic development overall in Canada suffer as a result of these kinds of economic partnerships. And they're extremely concerned, and we see this over and over again in this survey, that domestic sources of energy be prioritized. It's not clear to me that Canada is going to be importing that much energy anytime soon, but certainly a concern for Canadians. Similarly, when we ask about energy projects and environmental and social impacts, you see a little bit of a different story here. Here, Canadians are willing to make some sacrifices. In particular, they're quite willing to sacrifice some degree of tax revenue to government. They are willing to see fewer energy projects go forward in order to ensure that environmental and social impacts are being taken care of. And they're willing to take on some degree of energy price increase in order to protect the environment and to protect social impacts for communities. Again, more of a wash in terms of economic development, and they are not willing to accept energy imports. They want domestic sources of energy. And then lastly, we asked some specific questions about what would you be willing to do in order to reduce oil and gas production over time, or for Canada to meet its climate commitments. And in this case, they're very, very willing, very strongly willing to take on more energy infrastructure, although what people say in a survey versus what happens when the pipeline is going through their community or the windmills are going up or whatever else is happening is a completely different story. Happy to talk about that. They're willing to take fewer tax revenues, at least for meeting climate commitments, not so much in terms of reducing oil and gas development. And then we move into sort of mixed territory in terms of energy projects and energy price increases. They're not willing to see energy price increases as a return for reducing oil and gas development, but they are in terms of meeting climate commitments. And then we see, again, bigger concern for overall economic development in Canada as a whole and overall concern for domestic energy supply. And then lastly, the energy future. And these give us a sense of what Canadians see as possible going forward. We asked them some specific questions about, do you think this is a good idea? And so you'll see some of these here, and we've replicated some of this data again in 2017. So the first question is an important one. Can Canada develop its energy resources and protect the environment? Can we do both? And Canadians are overwhelmingly optimistic about this. This is really, really strong data at 81% level positive or somewhat positive on this issue. So extremely optimistic. Not clear to me whether that optimism will remain once we get into the details of how you do that. And secondly, in terms of asking how should the transition to a clean energy economy go, Canadians strongly favor a longer transition, right? This is not something we should aggressively move on, right? And this replicates some of the discussion we were hearing during the panel last night. So a long-term transition. And then secondly, should we have oil and gas, or thirdly, should we have oil and gas exports, insofar as they are replacing other dirtier fuels in other places, right? And here Canadians are relatively optimistic. How that gets counted and what the nature of that market looks like, not clear in this. So again, the devil may be in the details. And Canadians explicitly believe there's a role for the oil and gas sector being an environmentally responsible stakeholder, right? The idea that oil and gas production can be done in an environmentally responsible way is something that Canadians strongly believe in. And some specific actions we asked people, and again, we asked these questions back in 2017. Should we be negotiating an energy accord with Indigenous peoples as a whole in Canada? And very strong support for that, slightly weakened, but extremely strong nonetheless. Should we be growing the oil and gas sector? Yes, right? And so when you see that question, and then think about the question about the transition to a clean energy economy, there may be some dichotomy there. Should we be encouraging more oil refining? So the refining process occurring in Canada as opposed to other places, Canadians strongly in favor of that, of moving the production and processes here. Growth in the renewable energy sector is the single largest thing that Canadians want at an 88% net positive, right? Which actually means that the net positive overall 95% either in favor or somewhat in favor. Taxes on fossil fuels, these are net positive, but here there's a big change in a 1.5 long period, right? So the net positive moves to about plus 16. So again, Canadians willing to pay a price, but some of this enthusiasm wavering to a degree as we see the implication of carbon taxes, et cetera, starting to hit the road. And we asked two new questions, and I think they're really important questions, right? First, having a national energy policy, or at least a policy framework, a vision for the future, and Canadians overwhelmingly believe that we need that. And we probably need that. I mean, we have it to some degree, right? We heard some discussion of the Winnipeg Consensus, the Pan-Canadian Framework, et cetera. But I think what we need is a more detailed vision about how we move forward. And I think Canadians are looking for that as well. And should we create an independent energy agency that provides information for all of the stakeholders, right? Something similar to the Energy Information Agency in the United States or some variant thereof. And Canadians are strongly in favor of this. So some key takeaways that I think are worth thinking about. First, there are some strong and not so surprising demographic differences, right? In general, we see Quebec, women as opposed to men, and younger generations, the millennials, ages 18 to 30, more sort of what we would expect to clarify or define as kind of progressive roles, right? More strongly in favor of renewable energy production, less enthusiastic about fossil fuel production, and the two outlier sets of states are the prairies versus Quebec, right? Some distinct differences there. And you can see all these laid out in the full results. Secondly, a clear expectation and wish for higher level decision-making authority on energy projects at the provincial or at the national level, either way, with some edge going to an independent regulatory agency. And I think that's an important message right? So it may be that we've got many parts of our institutional structure correct. We need to tweak it. And priorities and trade-offs, right? We're willing to give in terms of tax revenues and in terms of the number of energy projects. We're much less willing to give in terms of economic development and domestic or energy imports of any kind. And oftentimes these sacrifices in particular are for environmental protection and climate change. And lastly, in terms of the future, and I think this is important, right? Survey data is notoriously contradictory. And so you see pieces of this, right? The classic one is people say, I want fewer taxes, but I want better roads, right? and then leave the hard decisions to the politicians. And so the challenge in some of the implications of this data is that politicians do indeed have a very, very difficult job ahead of them in which they're going to have to make hard decisions about what we need to do going forward. So this is consistent with long-term norms, with public opinion norms, right? We see this all the time. And so there are some limitations to what this data, we should always take this with a grain of salt. And I think an encouraging piece here is that there is consensus, right? There's optimism, but we do not see breakouts in this data, and I'm not sure if Nick is going to be providing some further analysis that demonstrates this stuff in terms of ideological or partisanship or party affiliation data. And so we may see some of that breakout. So the polarization is still there. It's a little bit buried in this data, and I think we shouldn't be naive about the fact that it's not there. But there is, the big message is there is a clear consensus emerging on many issues in Canada in terms of how Canadians think we are doing, what we need to do going forward, and what they expect from our governments. And so that is where I will leave us, and I'd be happy, I think I have a couple minutes for questions. Great, so I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this, and there's a microphone there so everybody can hear you.
Canada and the U.S. And thanks for your comments, by the way.
Yeah.
Sure. I wonder if you could extend that into this sphere, where when I look at this, we're into this intense, internally focused debate in Canada about the nature of the issues that you've been talking about. And at the same time, to use vernacular, we're getting our butts kicked in many dimensions, and it's not just oil and gas, in many economic dimensions by what our friends south of the border are doing.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you're in somewhat of a unique position in terms of comparing and contrasting the two countries. So I wonder if you could just offer a perspective on what's going on south of the border versus what's going on north of the border, and how the tension, if you will, between economic and environmental dimensions is playing out there versus here.
Sure, yeah. So in certain ways, in the United States, federalism is even more of a beast, if you will, than it is here in Canada, and federalism is very strong in Canada. So states have an enormous degree of latitude, and the variability between states in the United States. So to compare, for instance, what goes on in the Dakotas as compared to what goes on in California is just dramatically different. And so the degree of variation that we see in the states and what's going on at the state level has almost a higher degree of importance than it does here, and that's not to take away from the fact that the provinces have an enormous amount of power, but the U.S. states have an even greater degree of power. California is the 8th largest economy in the world, right, and it's probably on the bleeding edge of climate commitments and sort of transitioning to a new energy economy. And it still has some oil and gas development, for sure. They've just finished developing a fairly extensive set of shale regulations. There's also variation in terms, higher degree of variation in terms of regulatory oversight. And so I think there's some really strong examples in the United States of very effective regulatory oversight that takes into account development. Texas actually has been doing some really interesting things in terms of their oversight of the oil and gas industry that I think is relatively balanced. They're not yet taking on the climate challenge, but in terms of sort of thinking about what that looks like, it's also a little easier in Texas, right? I mean, West Texas has the highest wind in the United States, 20% almost of the entire energy economy and electricity, right? But there's cows in West Texas, and that's about it. So a much different dynamic. The other significant challenge that Canada faces is Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples, and its relationship with Indigenous peoples is completely different. I hate to say this, but Indigenous peoples are almost not part of the conversation in the United States, right? That's notwithstanding DAPL, or it's extraordinarily rare that they become part of the conversation. And here I think Canada is engaged in a much more serious conversation about how its relationship with Indigenous peoples is going to go forward, and what that means for the country in the long term. And that's a painful conversation to be having, but I actually think it's a worthwhile one, and I would love to see the United States engage in something like that. So Canada right now, in certain ways, is facing some of the challenges, even thinking about this at a national level, that the United States is just not having a conversation about. And what happens is we whipsaw from one administration to the other, and I see no reason that that's going to change anytime soon. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
It's Jay Prasad. You know, the interest in a national kind of program, right? That's one thing that was raised there.
Yeah.
And the EIA type of agency. Was that, you think the EIA type of agency is driven off mostly need for data in energy, or there are things that have been explored there? And,
yeah.
I was thinking also about a program, if given that we've moved away so far from the National Energy Program, and people have forgotten about that, might be one of the things. And you know, we've moved to market-oriented pricing system, if that might be, you know, one of the time we have forgotten about, you know, the program itself. Yeah.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts on that. So I think actually it's not clear that the kind of regulatory agency we're talking about is just an information agency, but I would also argue, and I make the explicit argument in the policy regulatory nexus, that we should be looking for a government agency that provides input on best practices for regulators. There are some extremely successful and strong components of regulation in Canada, and then there's areas that could improve. And so having an agency that also helps function as a source of expertise for agencies that are, for regulatory agencies that are doing oversight. So I see actually a dual role for some kind of regulatory agency that can provide support and assistance to different kinds of regulatory agencies and provide thinking on best practices and information as well. And then there was a second component of your question. I've lost it. Market operations? Sure. So again, you know, you still need regulators to oversee markets, and right now the Ontario ISO and several ISOs in the U.S. oversee very competitive restructured electricity markets, right? And you still need actually an enormous amount of regulation to ensure that market power is not existing, and a variety of other concerns. So, you know, whether we have competitive or market-oriented components, there are challenges there in terms of overseeing competitive processes in a way that also allows for stakeholder input. But it can be done, and I would encourage Canada to embrace some aspects of that. Yes.
Thanks. Thanks for the information. I think it's great survey and good to see how things change over time. But my question is, was there context given with the question? So for example, if not, and given last night's comments, even from Nick, that Canadians are saying they feel very uninformed about things, how much confidence can we have in the responses if people haven't got the context? So for example, when they're talking about, you know, we don't want any imports, but we already import oil and gas in this country, and when they talk about being willing to give up tax revenues, are they understanding what those tax revenues, you know, pay for in their lives? Economic development, if it was their job. So, you know, the confidence in those responses when people may not really understand the choices that they're suggesting, would they answer the same way if they knew what was involved?
So that's a great, and so the answer quite simply is no. You know, there's a very limited amount of context that is given in any public opinion poll. One of the challenges, I do a lot of public opinion research in different research projects that I do. It's always a challenge. You have to make the questions as short as possible. You have an enormous challenge, right? Nanos got a 10% response rate on this, and this is a very robust survey at the pretty much at the highest level. And it's an enormous challenge to get people to respond to these kinds of surveys, and you have to simplify. If you have, you know, a 2-paragraph long description for every question and you have 50 questions, you're not going to get people to finish the survey. So you should see this as sort of a directing point, right? And this is why we should always think about what the nature is. But it does actually remind us that one of the things that we can be doing, and I talk about this in the policy regulatory nexus, is our government and our regulators, our policymakers and our regulators, can be doing a much better job in terms of engaging with Canadians on what these issues are, on what the trade-offs are, on what we're talking about, right? And there's not a high degree of dialogue that is going along with Canadians between our policymakers and our regulators. And it's one of the areas, so we'll be talking about the case studies that were done 2 years ago. We did 6 case studies across Canada. And in that, over and over and over again, these were very specific case studies. People constantly talking about the lack of information they were getting from regulatory agencies, feeling like they were getting the runaround, not being able to find the information that they wanted or needed. Right, so this is an area where Canada can do better, right? And it's not to say that's every regulator. We have regulators who are doing a great job in terms of public engagement. I actually think, and there's certain kinds of best practices that we see being put into play right now. But there are areas where I think both our policymakers can be having, right, our governments can be having a dialogue with Canadians about the kind of decisions they're making, and our regulators can in terms of the process and the oversight.
Hi, I'm going to ask a follow-up question.
Sure.
So when you think, okay, when going back to the statement, like Nick Nanos said that a lot of Canadians feel engaged but uninformed. I was wondering if one of your questions would actually ask, included, whether they feel uninformed or not, or informed for this particular survey. And if you did include that question, if you found any systematic patterns in the response.
Yes, so we did ask that question, and it's embedded in there. I just didn't show it. Okay. So 2 quick responses. Canadians do feel very engaged, and we see that quite clearly. So number 1. And then number 2, they do feel uninformed, and they tell us that. And you'll see that data. What I can't remember is if we have 2015 or 2017 data on that. It'll be in the report that's on the website, but I don't remember offhand whether we have a systematic pattern. Okay. It's certainly, I think, in the age of fake news and sort of social media and the fragmentation of information and news sources, I think it's an enormous challenge these days to get reliable information from non-biased sources. Extraordinary challenge in the digital age.
Thank you.
Okay, Dave.
Quick, but maybe not quick to answer, unfortunately. In a couple of spots, you mentioned independent as a qualifier. But regulatory boards, of course, are creatures of government, as are the EIA in the States is a creature of government. So what do you think is meant by independent when you say independent energy information agency or independent regulator?
So you can have regulatory agencies that are independent, and you know, two really good examples in the United States are the analyses by the Congressional Budget Office, which is notoriously nonpartisan, explicitly, and very, very neutral, and is one of the reasons why Congressional Budget Office analyses are considered, you know, a very strong gold standard. In the energy world, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States is exemplified as a very, very independent agency, right? Those appointments are made by government, but they're staggered over time. There's a norm at FERC that they appoint commissioners from each party. So typically there's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats, or vice versa, depending on who's in power. A lot of regulatory agencies have explicit requirements for different kinds of representation on their oversight boards or on their boards. So many of the ISOs in the United States have explicit representation from consumer advocates, from environmentalists, having industry advocates, having utility advocates on their boards, right? So there are ways to create balance and independence, and to structure and institutionalize those expectations for independent agencies. And we see that in Canada. I want to make clear, you know, when I critique, I'm not critiquing everything with a washboard, right? We see there are good independent regulatory agencies in Canada, and then there's other times where those concerns have been raised, that we're seeing processes, we're seeing decision making with interference from policymakers when it's not necessarily appropriate.